How soon will the national debt lead the United States to an economic catastrophe? Let's go back to the year 2000. At that time, America's national debt was around $10 trillion, which was already quite significant, but the U.S. had a budget surplus, and the country was on an economic upswing. However, over the next 25 years, the world witnessed an unprecedented surge in American borrowing, so massive that the U.S. national debt has tripled in size. Today, that figure has climbed to an incredible $36 trillion, and let's be honest, that number feels a whole lot scarier than $10 trillion ever did. But the real question is, how did we get here? Let me show you this chart. It tracks what the U.S. has to pay just in interest on its debt. Back in 2020, the bill was about $523 billion, and in just the last 6 months, the government has already paid $478 billion in interest on the debt. And keep in mind, we still have half the year left, so that number's only going up, not down. For the full 2024 fiscal year, interest payments hit about $1.13 trillion. That's more than double what it was in 2020. So, what's driving this massive jump? Honestly, the same problem most of us deal with, spending more money than we actually make, and the US government is no exception. By the way, this is exactly what Elon Musk is trying to address with his so-called Department of Government Efficiency. And naturally, when your expenses exceed your income by this much, a serious budget deficit is the result. And how do they cover it? With borrowed funds, which the U.S. obtains by selling bonds. Here's how it works. The government issues a piece of paper stating that it promises to pay you, the investor, $1,000 after 6 months, a year, or even 10 years. These bonds come with different maturity periods. Investors buy these contracts, essentially lending their money to the government. And most importantly, these bonds aren't just about getting your money back. They also come with an interest rate that the government has to pay you every year. For example, let's say you buy a 3-year bond with a 4% annual interest rate. The math's pretty straightforward. For 3 years, you'll collect 4% of the bond's value each year, and once the term is up, you also get your original money back. And the bigger the budget deficit gets, the more bonds the government has to put on the market just to borrow enough money and patch things up. The real issue is that the US hasn't seen a budget surplus in nearly 25 years. The deficit keeps increasing, and there are no signs of improvement. The US government right now is kind of like someone taking out new credit cards just to pay off the old ones. It just keeps digging deeper into debt. The current economic situation of the United States was aptly described by Ray Dalio, the billionaire founder of the world's largest hedge fund, in his recent interview.
Right now, we're at a juncture. If the budget deficit can be reduced to 3% of GDP, it will be about 7% if things are not changed. This could all be managed very well. If they don't, we're going to have a supply-demand problem for debt at the same time as we have these other problems. And the results of that will be worse than a normal recession.
Which brings us to the big question. Why has this turned into such a pressing issue just in the last few years? The answer is interest rates. Let's break it down with a simple example. Imagine an ordinary American family buying a nice home with a $1 million mortgage. At first, the interest rate is just 0.5%. Not too scary. That works out to about $5,000 a year in interest. But if that rate suddenly shoots up to 5%, their yearly interest bill doesn't just rise. It explodes to $50,000. That's a massive hit to any family budget. And the same principle applies to America's national debt. The difference is, it's not one big loan sitting on the books. It's made up of thousands of smaller loans, all with different repayment timelines. Some come due in just a month, while others stretch out 10, 20, even 30 years into the future. The interest rates on these loans aren't all the same. They change depending on when the U.S. government actually issued the bonds. That's where something called the average interest rate comes in handy. So how do we figure it out? It's actually not too complicated. We know that in 2020, the average interest rate on U.S. government debt was 1.72%. If we recall the example of a $1 million mortgage, that would be $17,200 per year. But over the past 5 years, a lot has happened in the world. COVID, geopolitical instability, inflation. To tackle all this, the U.S. Federal Reserve ramped up interest rates from 0 to 4.5%. So, what did that mean for the U.S. national debt? Well, just like a family struggling to pay off older loans, the American government suddenly found itself earning too little to cover interest on its older bonds. They have to refinance the debt, which basically means replacing the old loan with a new one, and now at much higher interest rates. This makes a chunk of that $36 trillion debt even more expensive just because of this no-win situation. As a result, the average interest rate has jumped from 1.72% in 2020 to 3.28% today. Back to our $1 million mortgage example. That annual interest now comes out to about $32,800. That's a massive hit to the budget. This means the U.S. is forced to increase its debt every year by selling new bonds, while at the same time refinancing old debts at high interest rates. Expenses are skyrocketing. But does this mean the U.S. will have to take extreme measures and declare a default? Their national debt is enormous. There's no denying that. But is it really that dangerous? Remember, we talked earlier about how the U.S. is currently spending much more than it earns. Well, interest payments make up a huge part of the American government's expenses. Right now, the U.S. is already spending more on interest than on national security and healthcare. The only thing Americans spend more on is Social Security, and on top of that, interest rates are still climbing. The budget deficit is growing, so what is the U.S. government forced to do at the end of each fiscal year? Well, it's borrowing even more money just to cover its existing debts. And honestly, this cycle feels impossible to break. To put that in perspective, last year alone, the U.S. federal government spent $880 billion just on paying interest on its debts. That's 4 times more than it was 10 years ago. It's more than what the U.S. spends on the military, and almost as much as healthcare. The U.S. does have a problem, and it's obvious, but don't expect Americans to declare a default the way most people imagine. It's not like Argentina, where the government just admitted it couldn't pay its debts. Why? Because the U.S. basically has a monopoly on printing the world's main currency, the dollar. They also use it to borrow and repay debts. Technically, they could just print new dollars endlessly to solve their problems. Sounds easy, right? But if it were that simple, we wouldn't even be talking about this issue right now. Printing money to pay off debt isn't just pressing a button or issuing a decree. If the printing presses start running too hard, America would face real consequences, like inflation and a loss of trust in the dollar. Investors would immediately demand higher interest rates on Treasury bonds because they need compensation for the risk. Government debt gets even more expensive, and the cycle just keeps spinning. And here's where the real danger is. Economists and rating agencies love their stats, especially things like interest payments as a percentage of GDP. In simpler terms, what part of the economy does the government spend on paying interest on its debts? Historically, the limit for the U.S. is considered to be around 3% of GDP. If it hits 4 to 5%, other important stuff like healthcare, defense, and infrastructure starts getting squeezed. And once it hits 6%, things can get seriously ugly. The credit rating would drop, there would be panic in the bond market, and trust in the dollar would fall. Now let's look at the numbers. The U.S. GDP is around $28 trillion. That means $1.13 trillion in interest payments for the 2024 fiscal year is roughly 4% of GDP. This is the moment when interest payments stop being just numbers on a chart and start becoming a real danger for America. To get a clearer picture, just look at Argentina and Greece. These are 2 developing markets that ended up in the same kind of mess. Argentina, for example, has declared default on its national debt 9 times, the most recent being in 2020. And before every default, the pattern was the same. Interest payments hit 4% of GDP. What does that mean in simple terms? Every $25 the country produces goes straight to paying interest on government debt. Notice, this isn't even about repaying the principal debt, just the interest. When investors saw this, they started to panic. They demanded higher interest rates on loans because they feared a default. Their demands were met, and as a result, Argentina's interest rate rates kept rising. Money started flowing out of the country at an enormous speed. The local currency collapsed. Inflation shot through the roof. In the end, Argentina had no choice but to turn to the IMF for help more than once. Greece ran into a similar mess. You probably remember that high-profile Eurozone crisis. Greece was spending nearly 8% of its GDP just to cover interest on its debts. But unlike the US, Greece doesn't print its own dollars. It uses the euro, and when investors lost confidence in the country, Greece couldn't do anything. It had to turn to friends in the European Union and the IMF for help. This was followed by strict economic measures, cutting social spending, raising taxes, and other painful but unavoidable steps. Unemployment soared and the economy came to a standstill. It was not a good time for Greece. So, what's the takeaway from all this? When debt payments exceed 5 to 6% of GDP, even just the fear of default can knock a country's economy off its feet. A debt spiral forms, and escaping it is nearly impossible. But we understand that the US is nowhere near being like Argentina or Greece. Unlike them, Americans borrow in their own currency, which, by the way, is the world's main currency. They also have the Federal Reserve, which can, in extreme cases, buy US debt. There is an advantage, but the risk doesn't disappear. So it's unlikely that the US will face a sudden default, but there is a significant chance of a slow, creeping buildup of a debt crisis. That is, of course, if the spiraling debt is not brought under control by the US government. In the end, everything depends on confidence in America's future. As long as people believe that the US will pay its debts no matter what, the system will function. But let's remember the world we live in: natural disasters, new diseases, geopolitical instability, and most importantly, in the US, a person can come to power from whom anything can be expected, like huge trade tariffs. Then trust could quickly vanish. Speaking of Trump's trade policies, many economists are concerned that the tariffs he introduced could trigger a surge in global inflation. If that happens and prices in America rise significantly, the Federal Reserve would have to raise interest rates again. And here, as you probably understand, U.S. government debt would be refinanced at higher rates, forcing the country to spend more and bringing it closer to the dangerous point where investors lose confidence and panic begins. Think we're exaggerating? Then remember that in 2011, the U.S. credit rating was downgraded by Standard & Poor's from AAA to AA+ for the first time since 1917. And do you know why? Because of the rapid growth of government debt, which exceeded $14 trillion. And just recently, in 2023, the rating agency Fitch downgraded the U.S. rating. The reason was simple: political gridlock and rising government debt. It's literally a wake-up call from the credit world. And finally, let's wrap up the argument about printing money. Yes, if things get really bad, the Federal Reserve can print more money and save America. Right? Well, not exactly. More money means higher inflation. The whole world has seen this in recent years by watching prices rise. And what usually follows inflation? That's right, higher interest rates. And by now, you've probably remembered that this leads to the same increase in government debt. In short, the situation doesn't look great either way, and you might wonder, why should anyone outside the US even care? The answer is pretty simple. Whatever happens in our economy eventually reaches the rest of the world.